So Iran will not stop. Iran cannot stop. Iran's control of the Strait of Hormuz is its only real weapon. And as long as this war continues, Iran will keep using it. This is the fundamental difference. In 1973, the oil crisis was a temporary political tool. In 2026, the oil crisis is a permanent structural feature of this war. And the war has no end in sight. Okay, now I want to go deeper, because the Strait of Hormuz story is actually just the beginning.
The full picture is much more complicated and much more dangerous.
Let me explain how the oil crisis is destroying not just prices, but the entire petrodollar system that Henry Kissinger built in 1974. Remember I said that Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states sell oil, get dollars, and recycle those dollars back into the American economy. That is the engine of American power. That is what funds American government debt. That is what funds the AI bubble and the technology companies that are now the foundation of the American stock market. But now look at what is happening to the Gulf states. The Strait of Hormuz carries not just oil out of the Gulf, it also carries food into the Gulf. The Gulf countries import 80 to 90% of their food supply. All of it comes through the Strait of Hormuz. Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, these are desert cities. They cannot grow their own food. They depend completely on imports. So when the strait closes, the food stops. Within days, cities of millions of people start running out of food. Within weeks, they run out completely. And it gets worse. Because the Gulf countries also depend on desalination plants for their fresh water, they live in a desert. There are no rivers. There is almost no groundwater. The only way they get fresh water is by taking seawater and removing the salt. These desalination plants provide 60% of all fresh water for the Gulf countries. And a $50,000 Iranian drone, not a sophisticated missile, just a cheap drone, can destroy a desalination plant worth billions of dollars. If the desalination plants are hit, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait run out of water in 2 weeks. 2 weeks! Cities of 10 million people, no water. Now here is the consequence for the petrodollar system. If the Gulf states cannot sell their oil because the strait is closed, they do not have petrodollars.
If they do not have petrodollars, they cannot recycle money back into America. If they cannot invest in America, the AI bubble bursts, the stock market crashes, American government bonds lose their buyer, American debt becomes impossible to service.
The entire American financial system, which depends on this constant recycling of Gulf oil money, starts to collapse. Okay, now I want to show you something. I want to show you what this oil crisis actually looks like on the ground. Not as numbers on a chart. Not as oil prices on a screen, but as real human suffering happening right now, today, in countries all around the world. Let us start with India. India is the world's third largest oil importer, a country of 1.4 billion people, and 40% of India's crude oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz. But the problem for India is not just crude oil. The bigger problem is LPG, cooking gas. India gets 90% of its LPG imports through the Strait of Hormuz. And LPG is not a luxury in India. LPG is how 300 million Indian households cook their food every single day. This is India, the world's fastest growing major economy. 1.4 billion people, and they are fighting over cooking gas cylinders because of a war that started in the Persian Gulf. Now let us go from India to something that is, and I say this very carefully, one of the most extraordinary stories of this entire crisis: Cuba. Now, Cuba and the Iran war. You might be asking, what does Cuba have to do with the Iran war? Cuba is in the Caribbean. It is 90 miles from Florida. It is nowhere near the Strait of Hormuz or the Persian Gulf. And you are right, Cuba has nothing to do with the Iran war directly. But Cuba is suffering the worst energy crisis of any country in the world right now. And the reason why tells you everything about the kind of world we are living in. Okay, so let me explain. Cuba does not have enough oil of its own. Cuba produces about 40% of the fuel it needs. The rest it imports. And for the past 20 years, the country that supplied most of Cuba's oil was Venezuela. Venezuela would send Cuba roughly 35,000 barrels of oil per day under a special arrangement. Cuba provided doctors, teachers, and security advisors to Venezuela in exchange for discounted oil. It was a barter deal, and it kept Cuba running for 2 decades. But then, in January 2026, Trump sent American forces into Venezuela and arrested the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro. America took control of Venezuelan oil, and immediately the oil shipments to Cuba stopped, completely. On top of that, Trump signed an executive order threatening massive tariffs on any country in the world that dared to sell oil to Cuba. Mexico, which was also supplying oil to Cuba, immediately suspended its shipments because it was afraid of American tariffs.
And the reason I find this so historically important, and here is where I want you to really pay attention, is that this is the same strategy being applied in the Middle East. What America did to Cuba with oil, Iran is now doing to the entire American-aligned world with the Strait of Hormuz. One country controls the oil supply of another, cuts off the oil, collapse the economy, force the government to surrender or be replaced. America invented this strategy. America used it on Cuba, on Iran for decades through sanctions on Venezuela, on Russia, and now Iran is using the exact same strategy back against America and its allies. The Strait of Hormuz is America's own weapon turned against it. And Cuba, this tiny island that has nothing to do with Iran or the Strait, Cuba has become the collateral damage of this global oil war, a demonstration of what happens when a country loses its oil supply, a preview of what awaits any country that is on the wrong side of whoever controls the oil. Okay, let me now bring all of this together. In 1973, the oil crisis was a crisis of price. Oil became more expensive. That was painful. In 2026, the oil crisis is a crisis of the entire system. It is not just that oil is more expensive, it is that the system that has organized the global economy for 50 years, the petrodollar system, is being dismantled in real time. Think about the chain of events. Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz. Oil prices explode from $70 to $122 in weeks. Japan, which gets 75% of its oil through the strait, is told it will run out of oil in 7 to 8 months. India, 1.4 billion people, is fighting over cooking gas cylinders. The Gulf states that fund American debt and the American stock market face existential threats to their food and water supply. Cuba, 11 million people, sits in complete darkness because America weaponized their oil supply in a completely separate conflict. And urea prices, fertilizer, have jumped 50%. Meaning food prices will rise for the next 2 years, even after this war ends. The world is being pushed structurally away from the dollar-centered system and toward whatever comes next. Not because China is so powerful, but because America's system has become so fragile, so overextended, so dependent on controlling the oil of others, that one war, one small channel of water 33 kilometers wide, can threaten to bring the whole thing down. And here is the final point I want to make. The most important point of all. The 1973 oil crisis had a Kissinger, a brilliant strategic mind who looked at the crisis, understood what was happening structurally, and built a new system, the petrodollar, a solution that lasted 50 years. Who is the Kissinger of today? Who has the plan? America's response to this crisis has been to unsanction Iranian oil, giving Iran $14 billion in days, more than their entire yearly military budget, and call it a brilliant strategy. To say Cuba is next while 1 million people in Havana do not have water to drink. To threaten tariffs on any country that tries to help a neighbor in a humanitarian emergency. There is no Kissinger today. There is only improvisation, day by day, crisis by crisis, tweet by tweet. And that is the real difference between 1973 and 2026. In 1973, the crisis produced a genius. In 2026, the crisis is revealing the absence of one. The 1973 oil crisis was painful but temporary. It lasted months and produced a solution that lasted 50 years. The 2026 oil crisis is structural and permanent. It is not producing solutions. It is destroying the system itself. And the consequences of that for your savings, for the price of food on your table, for the lights in your city, will be felt for the next 20 years. This is not just a war in the Middle East. This is a turning point in history. And most people are watching the bombs and missing the real story. The real story is the oil. The real story is always the oil.